What if everything you thought you knew about faith, religion, the universe, and success wasn't the whole truth? What if the answers have been in front of us all along, hidden in religion, science, and the very fabric of reality? I grew up in the Bible Belt, surrounded by deep faith, but as I got older, I started questioning. That search led me to study psychology, philosophy, and ultimately law, where I was trained to analyze evidence and think critically. As a prosecutor and later a defense attorney, I built my career on uncovering the truth beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, I bring that same investigative mindset to life's biggest questions: faith, spirituality, and the forces that shape our lives. I'm Alexis Austin, and this is Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, the search for truth. It's time to uncover the evidence. All right, on a previous episode, I promised you all that I would dive in a little bit and give you some history and background on who I am and where I came from. I think this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think it's important to get to know your host in some way if you don't already know them. If you're coming to this podcast and you've never heard of me and never met me, my name is Alexis Austin. I am a former prosecutor, criminal defense attorney turned consultant for law firm business owners, life coach, and now podcaster. But the real purpose behind this podcast is to teach these principles of success that I've learned over the last 20 years. But to do that, I think it's important to show a lead up to how I got here, so that if you're in any stage that I'm describing or anywhere similar, it gives you that sign that you can do what I've done as well and more. For those of you who do know me, this is a little bit of a raw expose where I'll be talking about things that I have not shared with the world. And I think that this is part of both a way to get it out, to cleanse myself of the things that I'm holding on to that I haven't shared publicly, but also taking that leap of faith that I've decided is the next step for me, and just being myself completely in every single way. And that means being myself to friends, to family, to colleagues. I've gotten really good, or I had gotten really good over the past 20 years or so, putting on the right face for each crowd. I learned early on how to adapt and how to conform myself to whatever group I was in. And the time for that is over. I truly believe that you cannot live and be as successful as you can be in life by being inauthentic. And I know we hear authenticity and all this kind of language in a lot of the self-help ideas in books and podcasts. But what I mean is authentic in building trust with yourself. It has less to do with me talking about these things with the world. It's more about being honest with myself about who I am and where I came from, because trust starts with you. There's a great book on that, actually, while we're talking about this, and I will do this throughout the podcast, give you book recommendations, and we'll dive into a couple of them as we go. But one great book that I recommend on building trust with yourself is literally entitled Trust, and it's by an author named Alanya Van Zant. She is phenomenal at describing how trust with yourself is really a key starting point in having success in life. But I digress, in part because I have been avoiding a lot of this conversation for a very long time. But I want to go through and give you all a brief history of who I am and where I came from, so that you can understand the perspective from which I'm coming to these ideas of success. So I was not born Alexis Austin. In fact, Alexis Austin is my maiden name. I actually got married a couple of years ago, and my last name is actually Lytle now, Litle, like the title of the book. But I use Alexis Austin because it's alliterative. A lot of people know me by this name, and it's easy to pronounce. So that's my first truth, is Alexis Austin is my former name. But I was not born Alexis Austin. I was born Alexis Partridge, and I was born in an army base to a mother and a father who were very, very young. And we moved eventually. My mom and my dad got divorced, and we moved to a little town in the middle of nowhere called Barren Plains, Kentucky. And I tell you what, Barren Plains is the perfect description for this place. No offense, family, if you're listening to this, but we can all agree there is literally nothing there. I take that back. There is one store. It was, at the time, it was a store/gas station with one or two pumps, and a place where you might be able to get a sandwich depending on whether they made one that day. But that was it. And the next town over was a town called Dot. I don't know if they just didn't have any more creative names, or they said, here's a map and look, there's a dot on the map. I don't know. But that's the environment in which I was raised for the majority of my childhood. As part of that environment, my mom remarried and my stepdad, who was part of this wonderful family. And part of this family was they had a church. So I grew up as being raised in this very small community. It was a very close-knit community. No joke, all of my family lived within a mile radius of me, and we all went to the same church, which was in a tiny log cabin on my grandfather's property, which was right next to my house. Now, some people have called this a cult. I can see how people would think that, but it was not a cult. It was just a very small family church. With that, though, we had unique small town experiences. And I was raised in this environment of very deep faith. It was in the South. It was all of those things that you hear about as far as experiences in the Bible Belt. And our particular sect of Christianity, we were Pentecostal, and my family still identifies themselves as Apostolic Pentecostal. Now, for those of you who have heard those terms before, you may think of like Eastern Tennessee snake handlers. We were not snake handlers. We did not handle snakes. That was crazy people. But there was a lot of spirituality in the Apostolic Church and still is to this day. And that's the environment in which I was raised. I was raised from this perspective of having a close relationship with God, listening to the people in charge. So the elders of the church, the pastors, and seeking connection with God through that lens of apostolic faith. We did have speaking in tongues. I saw a number of interesting religious events occur. We would go to other churches and other church groups. So it wasn't at my church necessarily that I saw some of these things, but during the course of my childhood, I was exposed to exorcisms. I was exposed to faith healing. I was exposed to speaking in tongues. I was exposed to one person during my childhood, I remember this vividly, claimed to have spit up a demon in a toilet. There were some wild things that we experienced. So that was the background that I came from. I also was homeschooled. Again, it sounds like, oh my gosh, small town homeschool. But my mother actually was very adamant on homeschooling me because she brought to my education a wider array of information than was available in the small town school that I was originally enrolled in. So my education was actually incredibly robust. I get a little bit grumpy when people think homeschoolers are dumb. The homeschooling group that I was a part of was just comprised of incredibly intelligent human beings. Most of them had pulled their children out to teach their children in a way that actually more aligned with their values. And we actually got together and had a homeschool group where we would meet with other parents. So we had like a professor in biology and chemistry come, and I think he had a PhD in chemistry, and he would teach us. Anyway, it was a very good experience. But there were things that were not so great. So again, it wasn't my family church, but there were things that I was exposed to in this time of life where I developed very negative impressions of what it meant to be a leader in religion. I had very negative experiences with certain leaders of other churches, people who called themselves higher levels, so like deacons or bishops or things. There was very much an element of women were supposed to be in their place. We grew up not being able to cut our hair, only wearing skirts. And it was because that's what we were taught from the doctrines of the apostolic faith. There were some other things, and to protect the names of people involved, I will not go into detail about who this was or where it happened or when, but I also was sexually molested by a person who is a high up religious figure. And that really began my divide from God and from faith. I didn't know it at the time, though. I used to, and I get emotional thinking about it, but I remember part of the apostolic faith is, in any kind of charismatic Christian religion, there's usually an altar call. And I remember there was this period in my life when I was young, I was not a teenager, and I would be at the altar sobbing. Just sobbing. And I think my parents probably thought maybe I just like fed into this is what it means to be a true religious person. They didn't quite understand it. And there was no way I was going to tell anybody what was going on. And to be honest and fair to my family, I didn't remember what happened. I repressed what happened to me very, very deeply until I was about 27 years old. And we'll get to that part of the story. But during this time, I was really struggling. I was struggling as a young child with my relationship with God, with faith, with people in positions of authority. And that kind of set the stage for what happened throughout my life. I went through, as everybody I think does, a little period of rebellion when I cut off all my hair, started wearing makeup, started wearing very, very revealing clothing in high school. I went through that for a couple of years. I ended up actually coming back to my faith and getting married at the age of 18. This was something that was very normal in the environment in which I was raised. I met my then husband at a church camp and got married very, very young. That did not last long, as you might suspect. And within 3 years, I was divorced by the age of 21. But all of this is to say I had this deep spiritual background that kind of led me on this path of searching. Once I got into college, I at first was trying to find a career that would complement my husband. I had literally been told, not by my family church, but by the churches that were associated with our church, specifically in a church camp. I had been told that my job was to support my husband in my life and in my career. And so I believed that the only thing that I could really do as far as a career was to find something that supported him. So he was going to pharmacy school, so I needed to find something that would support that. I was looking at being a teacher. I was looking at being some kind of tech or a nurse. So for a couple of years in school, I was in a biology major for a hot second, a communications major, an education major. I went through the gamut. Now, I will tell you, I actually ended up going to college my high school year. I started going to college my senior year of high school, just because when I finally went to high school, I wasn't homeschooled during high school. My mother had taught me so well that there wasn't a whole lot left in high school for me to learn, so I just jumped straight to college. So I started college around 15 or 16. But then when I went to a university after I was married, this is when I started investigating what can I do to support my husband. Now, when that marriage failed, it failed, I think, mostly because I was having an existential crisis. I could have made it work. I could have sought help. We did seek therapy, but I think what was really going on was there was something much bigger happening in my life where I was coming to terms with, or trying not to come to terms with, what had happened to me in my childhood. And I started down this very dark path. And that dark path continued for about 10 years. During that time, I was drinking very heavily, engaging in very unsafe behavior. And I really took it as, I think at some point I intentionally just said, screw it, I am abandoning everything that I was taught. I'm going the complete opposite way. But there was always this part of me that had to know what it all was about, what was going on. And so as I was going through this kind of rebellious stage and trying to figure out life and existence, I decided to get a degree in psychology because I thought, well, if I can understand my mind, then I can help other people. And so I told myself at first that I was going into psychology to understand the idea of mass hysteria and how like religion develops around these shared concepts. But really what I was doing is I was trying to understand myself because, like I said, I had repressed those memories of sexual abuse from a younger time. And I think I was subconsciously trying to bring it forward and understand it, but in a way that made logical sense. And in addition to all that psychological research that I was doing, I worked in psych labs. I worked in PTSD labs. It's so strange and crazy to look back. Although now at this point in my life, I understand there was a reason why I was studying PTSD, right? My subconscious was trying to tell me, hey, this is something you should pay attention to. But like I talked about in an earlier episode, I had gotten very good at quieting that still small voice of subconscious, the universe, God, whatever you want to call it. I had learned to shut it out completely. So I was doing all these things, and in the midst of it, I've always been an overachiever, even when I was going through the darkest periods in my life. So I couldn't just take a normal caseload, right? I think I was taking on average around 21 to 23 credit hours a semester. It was insane. But I've always had that trait where I work hard to run from the truth. I work hard to avoid the problems. I stay so busy that I can't think about anything else. And I think that a lot of people go through that. They are just trying to go, 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 go. Because if they stop, if they allow themselves to pause, then there's that opportunity for truth to come in. There's that opportunity to recognize what it is you've been avoiding. And it's much safer to just push through and push through and push through and strive than to sit with it and to let things unfold naturally and to understand what it is that you deep down are trying to show yourself. So that's what I was doing. But like I said, I've always tried to find the truth in things, even without recognizing that I was doing it. So while I was getting my psychology degree and I was working 2 jobs at 2 different restaurants and working in 2 different psychological research labs, I also started studying philosophy. And I started out because I was saying, okay, I want to understand the way I was raised. I want to understand religion. And so I started off studying the Abrahamic faiths. So I took a couple of philosophy courses on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam and how they're all connected. And then as I got into philosophy, I couldn't pull myself away. I just kept signing up for classes where by the end of my college career, I was there for 4 years. By the end of it, I went to my college advisor and I had 1 semester left and I was saying, okay, well, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to graduate, magna cum laude or whatever. And they said, well, I'm looking here at your transcripts, and if you take 1 more philosophy class, then you'll have a double major in psychology and philosophy. Not a minor, a double major. And I had no idea. I'd done it unintentionally, but this was really the starting point of showing me how much I wanted to dig in and how much I wanted to learn. And again, it was that subconscious, that small voice trying to say, hey, look, there's more here. You're doing this even accidentally. But very, very long story long. I finished my courses, and then I was stuck. I had what I perceived to be 2 completely useless degrees, 1 in psychology and 1 in philosophy. Like, what do you do with that? So I was talking to a friend one day, and this is how I operated my life for that 10-year period. I would just make a choice and just go and just see what happened without taking the time to really think about it. Before I was trained to go to God and seek guidance and to pray. And so I think I went the opposite direction and just said, okay, well, I'll just try that. So I went and said, okay, well, the only 2 things I can possibly think of are I could get a PhD in psychology and be a clinician, or I could go to law school. Those are the only 2 things that make sense with these degrees. So a friend of mine and I just made a deal. My friend said, I'll take the GRE and see what happens there. I said, okay, I'll take the LSAT, see what happens. And then if I get a good score, maybe I'll go to law school. I actually ended up forgetting I signed up for the LSAT and took it. I had an alarm set and woke up that morning realizing, oh crap, I better go take the LSAT. So I had to take it twice, but I ended up getting a good enough score to get into a great law school. I went to the University of Denver, and that was a huge step for me because I pulled away from my family. I moved 2,000 miles away, jumped into law school, and that's when things started getting dark. And this is a period that I have not shared with my family very much. They know some of it because they saw what was going on, especially on social media, but things got dark. I started just drinking every single day so heavily, and I was engaging in very, very dangerous behavior. I was basically rushing. I was trying to find that adrenaline rush. Anything I could do. Riding on the back of motorcycles with no helmets, doing stupid things, going on trips that I didn't have. I was out of control. I was in a spiral. And when I was alone in my apartment, so I had my dog. I always have a dog. I had my dog, and I would do everything I could to find people going out. Who's going out tonight? What's going on? I had to stay busy because the few times during that 3-year period of law school that I actually allowed myself to get quiet, I was incredibly depressed. It was so dark. I remember there were times when I would be all alone in my apartment, sitting with a bottle of wine, just chugging straight from the bottle. And I had a knife in my hand, looking at my arm, thinking, how could I cut my arm to just be done? And I remember that happened a couple of times. And the only reason I didn't do it was because I looked over and saw my sweet dog there and thought, well, I can't do that to my dog. That was the only reason I didn't. So I was in a very dark place. However, as with most overachievers, very few people knew because I was also working. I was working at 2 different jobs. I always do that. I had 2 different internships. I was going to school full time, and I was just pushing. Fast forward to the end of law school, I ended up getting a job as a prosecutor. And I think it was all that subconscious trying to say, hey, you need to help these people that are abused and hurting. And I had this idea in my head that I wanted to be a SVU prosecutor, a special victims unit prosecutor, to help sex assault victims. The irony is not lost on me looking back at my childhood, but I had no idea. I had completely repressed these memories. And I went and I started my career as a prosecutor. I loved it. I loved being a prosecutor. Again, I worked myself to death. And back then I was working around 100 hours a week, making about 40 to 42,000 a year. And it was an experience where I was doing something that I felt was worthwhile, but I was still struggling. I don't have enough time in this podcast to go into depth about everything that happened, but I had quite an experience, and I was always searching. I was always looking. I had, through that period of time from leaving undergrad to a couple of years into my prosecutorial career, I was terrible with relationships. I had so many dates and so many, jumping from boyfriend to boyfriend. I was not emotionally steady, and I was searching and I was spinning. Then I met this man who was a prosecutor in another county and decided to engage in a relationship with him, and ended up sticking with it longer than I had before. So usually my relationships, they were either on and off relationships, which could span anywhere from a couple of weeks to on and off for a couple of years, or they lasted a hot second. But this one I made last a couple of years, and it was obvious now looking back that I was searching for someone who is as broken and hurting as I was. And that is always a dangerous place. If you are in that position where you're broken and hurting and you're finding another broken, hurting person, it is a dangerous place to be because you feed into it. That was truly the most traumatic relationship of my life. It was, and the problem is I haven't talked about this a lot because we share a lot of the same friends, and we had a lot of the same friends then, and I'm still friends with a number of them now. And people didn't see that side. I got the privilege of seeing the dark side, and there was so much darkness there. I won't go into it all. There was a lot of family darkness. There was a lot of abuse, a lot of sexual abuse. Again, it kept coming up in my life and finding me. It was just a very, very dark period. And it got to the point where in 2016, I was done. I couldn't do it anymore. I was completely broken. And it's interesting because on the outside, everything looked good. I talked about on a previous podcast where I had gone through, I had a good career as a prosecutor. I had then jumped and been offered an opportunity to be a partner in a prominent criminal defense firm. And I was at that firm during this time, and everything on the outside looked good. I was learning business. I was pushing, trying to grow the business. On the outside, I looked like I was holding it together. But on the inside, I was destroying myself. I was engaging still in very destructive behavior. I was still drinking very heavily. I was out of control spiritually, mentally, and I was lost. 2016, I remember there were times in that relationship where he would kick me out of the house and I'd have to go live with friends for a couple of weeks. And then, it was a very domestic violence DV pattern. Then I would come back, and it was just living in this constant state of upset and the unknown. But I have reached a point where I just couldn't do it anymore. And I tried to commit suicide. And this is something that I don't talk about a lot, and I have not talked about it openly in public with most people. But I bring this up because I believe that every single person that is meant to do something more has to go through what's known as the dark night of the soul. I don't know why it is. I don't know if it's just because we have to go through this reckoning with what we are dealing with and what we're experiencing to turn out the noise to get to the truth of what's going on. For me, that's what happened. It wasn't until this point where I completely gave up that I started to open myself back up to who I really was and what my faith was leading me to do. But fortunately, in that very dark time, I was found before it was too late and rushed to the hospital, and then put on a 72-hour hold, and then put into a mental hospital. And that was my lowest point. I was this outwardly super successful person, and I looked down at my shoes that didn't have shoelaces and thought, what on earth am I doing here? What have I done to myself? What have I allowed to happen in my life? Why am I here? And as I was in that place, it was the first time where I had to have silence. Like I talked about before, there was no silence in my life. I was chaotic and crazy all the time. this was the first time where I had mandatory silence, because they don't give you a lot of TV in the psych ward. They don't give you really anything except a couple of books, and even those are limited. There's a lot of time just sitting. They'll give you a teeny tiny pencil so you don't hurt yourself with it, but a teeny tiny pencil and paper if you ask for it. That's about it. And so I remember sitting there. We got like, I think it was an hour outside a day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon. I remember sitting outside during my hour, scribbling, just writing, just finally letting myself sit in the quiet and think about what I had done, where I had come from, why I was here. And that was when things started to turn around. Now, I don't want to leave it at too dark a spot. I promise the story gets much better. Things get much lighter, but I think it's important to see that evolution from where I was to the darkest point so that you can see everyone has a story, everyone has a background. And from that point, in the next episode, I'll talk about what happened from that point and how I came to own multi-million-dollar businesses and have success and have a wonderful, loving relationship with my husband and have a son. It all turned out to be the most wonderful experience of my life because I was able to sit in that stillness and quiet. But I bring that up just in case if you are listening to this podcast and you are in a place like that, you are that low. Number one, do not get to the point that I did. Seek help immediately. If you need help at all, that you just are too embarrassed to reach out to friends and family, literally reach out to me. I don't care. I will talk with you. But seek help. Make sure that you are not letting yourself get to that low point, and instead allow yourself to engage with that quiet, because that's where the truth really comes in. So I will see you next time to finish part 2 of the story of who I am and how I got here. Hopefully you have a little time to jump into that now so we don't leave it at a dark spot here. But I look forward to talking to you all on the next episode of Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, The Search for Truth.